Thank you, Ryan, and welcome to today's session, Integrating Transportation and Land Use, Contributing to More Sustainable and Productive Places. Next slide, please. My name is Celeste Gilman, and I am the Transportation and Land Use Policy Advisor with WSDOT's statewide multimodal planning and data division. Joining me is Terry Chong, planner extraordinaire and the other half of the MPDD land use team. We'll be joined by special guests from the Department of Commerce, Washington City's WSDOT Regions and Headquarters Design, and University of Washington, who we will introduce before their segments. So put on your bike helmets, lace up your shoes, and get out your bus pass, because we are in for a whirlwind trip through the vast territory of transportation and land use coordination. Some of this may be familiar territory, some of it may be new. Our aim is, whatever your current level of knowledge, that you'll leave today's session equipped with a deeper understanding, accessible ways to talk about these concepts with internal and external partners, and a strong set of resources to learn more and put these ideas into practice. Before we continue, please take a moment now to go to menti.com and enter the code 50644722. We will be having Menti activities throughout the training, and we'd like you to be primed and ready. Note that we will have a new Menti code after the break. Also, you may have already noticed that Anna Ragazza-Barasa is assisting us by posting information and links into the chat that may be useful to you during today's session or as a follow-up. Next slide. Today, we'll be covering why integrating transportation and land use matters, what are the essential elements of effective integration, examples from cities and WSDOT regions, and the economic forces at play in the relationship between transportation and land use. By the end of this session, you will be able to explain to others the importance of integrating transportation and land use. You'll understand WSDOT's role relative to land use and see opportunities for you to contribute to more sustainable and productive places through integrating transportation and land use in your work. Next slide. Approaching land use as a tool for demand management is a practical solution and nests within the big tent of transportation systems management and operations. Well, let's dive into what it means to integrate transportation and land use. Land use and transportation are two facets of the same territory. One provides the origins and destinations, while the other provides the pathways. When these two subsystems are managed separately, this fuels the type of mismatch between demand and capacity shown here. Typically, vehicle congestion is looked at as a failure of the system, but looked at another way, this is a sign of incredible success. People are flocking to use the infrastructure we have provided. But what got us here won't get us to our vision. It's not that the past solutions were wrong. In many ways, they overachieved, but the problems we now need to solve have changed. We need to design for transportation efficiency, which means enabling people to achieve their daily goals with less travel. Next slide. In transportation, we've often assumed that we can provide the most utility by moving more people faster, typically in private vehicles. But the underlying need that people are trying to meet is access. When we reframe this problem, we uncover that access can be achieved in three ways. One, improving proximity by locating people and the activities they need to get to closer to each other. Two, avoiding the need for physical travel through the use of telecommunications, as we're doing today. Or three, providing mobility options for all people to be able to travel where they want to go. Next slide. Land use is the primary tool of access because it is the uses of land that create the destinations people want to go to. Land use is the tool that can improve the proximity between people and the places they want to reach. Next slide. The state transportation system has been primarily focused on the movement of large numbers of vehicles across long distances. However, an Overdependence on vehicles has a number of fundamental challenges. Next slide. Motor vehicles are by far the least spatially efficient form of transportation. All other forms of typical land-based transportation can move the same number of people in significantly less space. Next slide. Because of this geometric inefficiency, providing infrastructure that makes driving the most appealing option ironically pits drivers against everyone else who is now compelled to drive due to a lack of other options. Even in corridors with relatively high productivity of other modes, vehicle congestion is psychologically dominant because cars take up so much space. Next slide. Another issue with overdependence on driving is all the people who are left behind. There have always been people who are excluded from driving due to age, disability, or cost. These people are often shut out from access to education, employment, healthcare, healthy food, social connections, and more when the main means of access is driving. Next slide. Our current vehicle-dominated transportation system also exacts a heavy cost and loss of life. In Washington, hundreds of people are killed by motor vehicles every year. Next slide. This intersects with equity because those killed are disproportionately people outside of vehicles. Seattle, for example, only 7% of crashes involve vulnerable users, but vulnerable users make up 89% of people killed. Speeding is a fundamental factor in this. Statewide, 86% of pedestrians and bicycles killed occurred on roads with a posted speed limit over 25 miles per hour between 2010 and 2019. Next slide. This loss of life has a huge financial impact. Add to that the cost to build and maintain roadways, parking facilities, vehicles, and fueling systems, and it's clear the auto-dominated transportation system is a very expensive way to provide access. Next slide. The economic burdens of auto reliance extend to local communities. On a per acre basis, transportation efficient development, where customers are less diluted by the land demands of large roads and parking lots, has significantly higher economic productivity. This in turn can provide more tax resources for local governments. Next slide. Finally, transportation is the single largest source of climate destabilizing greenhouse gas emissions in Washington. Locally, pollution and habitat fragmentation generated by the highway system degrade the health and abundance of natural ecosystems and their native species. The fish passage barrier removal injunction is one example where WSDOT is now working to correct past impacts. Next slide. Unfortunately, in our efforts to help people drive farther, faster, we've created a lot of places that feel like this. Next slide. We can join the global trend and flip our orientation to focus first on creating access through proximity at a human scale. Next slide. There are a wealth of local, national, and international examples where the trend lines of population and vehicle growth have been decoupled by shifting which modes form the foundation of the transportation system. Next slide. Washington's continued population growth means that development has the opportunity to transform much of our built environment. When land use and transportation are built for humans, not private vehicles, then access and mobility can increase without commensurate growth in vehicle travel. Next slide. Transportation trends are made up of the aggregate individual decisions of all the people traveling in our state. People make choices based on their perceptions of the options reasonably available to them and the relative risks and merits of those options. For walking, bicycling, transit, and other more sustainable options to be competitive, there need to be complete networks for these options that are safe and comfortable, and destinations need to be within convenient travel time for each of these options. Next slide. In summary, transportation efficient communities provide proximity of destinations, where the locations of different types of uses are designed to maximize the number of people who have the option to live, work, learn, recreate, and meet their daily needs within a walkable neighborhood. Complete, low-stress multimodal networks that provide direct, safe, convenient, and welcoming systems of walkways, bike routes, and transit routes. Appropriate roadway characteristics for context and function, so that vehicle facilities are designed to be appropriate to the places they traverse. Yes, next slide. I would now like to welcome Dave Anderson, the Managing Director of the Growth Management Program at the Department of Commerce and a self-professed recovering transportation planner. Dave will give a brief overview of Washington's Growth Management Act. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Celeste. Is my video on?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll go ahead. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to at least get to see your initials today. My name is Dave Anderson. As Celeste said, I am the Managing Director of the Growth Management Program at the Department of Commerce, and I am a transportation planner by trade. Got my start here in Washington as a service planner for Pierce Transit in Tacoma, and I'm going to talk to you about the Washington's Growth Management Act. And when you think of the Growth Management Act, there's a number of ways you can think of it. One of the ways you can think of it is the RCW 3670A, the piece of legislation that was adopted in 1991. But as things have evolved over time, the GMA is really sort of the word we use to describe the entire state land use framework. So when you're thinking of the GMA, it's important that you think about the law in context. It's not just one piece of statute. It is a combination of law and practice involving how we build communities and how we manage issues of growth, how we manage issues of growth and development in a growing state. So that's really the context I'm going to be talking about in it today. And if you go to the next slide, transportation is heavily woven into the GMA. And if you look at the statute itself, you'll find it's one of the longest, most extensive, and most complex pieces of the statute itself. And that's really because transportation and the struggles with traffic and congestion were really part of the creation story of the GMA. And this is sort of one of the famous one of the stories we tell ourselves about where the GMA came from was this this legendary trip that Representative Joe King took from Vancouver up to Puget Sound, where it really came to a head. But transportation planning was a big part of the development of the GMA. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of particular issues that are critical to understand Washington's approach to transportation and planning. I'm going to talk about scale divides, and I'm going to talk about participation divides. Next slide. So participation, or really you can think of it in terms of information and decision flow in the whole process. There are two competing expectations that the community has for its decision-making process. Next, the first one. Just tell me what I need to do to get my permit. I want to pull a permit. I want to move forward. I already rented a backhoe. Tell me what I need to do. Next one. The other one is this. So there's this tension inherent in any land use system. Anywhere in the nation, you're going to find these two values that the public holds dear, both of them, but they exist in tension. One of them, certainty, predictability, finality. I know what I need to do. I know what the requirements are. And if I meet those requirements, I can be assured that I'll get a permit in a timely manner and I can move forward. The second one, this emphasis on a community-wide deliberative process where everybody has an opportunity to have a say. And we have to reconcile these two. And every land use framework in any state in the nation has to find a way to reconcile these. And in Washington, we've taken a very interesting approach to that. And that is, when you're talking about a comprehensive plan decision, a legislative decision of the city council, there's a very heavy emphasis on the deliberative side. Look at all the impacts, evaluate all the alternatives, have lots of input. Okay, look at the distribution of costs and benefits across the entire community and bring everybody into that conversation. Very critical. If you look at the procedures associated with a comprehensive plan, okay, the requirement that there's an annual docketing process, there's a very heavy emphasis on this. Whereas once that comprehensive planning decision is made, the expectations are set that, okay, this is going to be urban residential land. There's a shift radically, very heavy, and there's a very heavy emphasis at the project development stage in the Local Project Review Act on certainty and finality. There's a prohibition against revisiting what they call fundamental land use decisions, which are things like use and density and adequate public facilities and level of service. You can't revisit those at the permit counter. There's a requirement for permit timelines to be issued on very clear deadlines. Okay, very heavy emphasis on finality and certainty at the permitting process. So what does that mean? That means that there's a very high expectation that the conversations, the difficult conversations about what kind of facilities are needed, how you're going to pay for it, what pattern are we setting in motion, and how does this affect statewide or communities' interests, those conversations need to happen at the comprehensive planning stage. If you wait till a permit comes on, if you wait till a permit hits the counter, you're too late. Because the way, and that's largely because of the way we've reconciled these two competing values. Next slide. The next thing I want to talk about is this question of why does traffic keep getting worse? And I think there's a particular facet of transportation planning that that really drives this, and that is that the transportation planning is, and the impacts, assessing the impacts of transportation are not scale independent. Okay, they're dependent on scale. So what does that mean? If you think about sort of the two extreme ways of looking at transportation impact, one of them is what is the incremental impact that this one development will have on the system as a whole, holding everything else the same. Okay, we're just looking at this project's impact on this development. Okay, that's one way to look at it, the very piecemeal way to look at it. And if you repeat that process over and over and over and over again, what kind of geography do you create, and what kind of transportation system you create? That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is what kind of regional geography is most efficient in terms of transportation demand per capita. That's sort of looking at the problem from the other end of the spectrum. And the difficulty is that the answers you get to those questions are qualitatively different depending on which scale you start at. And it's one of the things that makes transportation a difficult problem to manage, because just taking the incremental approach and doing it over and over and over and over again gets you a qualitatively different result. Okay, and here's why I think that is. Okay, if you stand on a street corner in a busy, if you stand on a busy street corner and you look at the traffic going by, if you were to go back and look at the SEPA checklist that they did when they built that, they would do a traffic study and they would talk a lot about left turns, right turns, trip generation. They would have a pretty good idea of the impact that project has on the adjacent street. Okay, and every project will have an impact on an adjacent street, and that impact will slowly fade over time to the point where once you're looking at the metropolitan system as a whole, that impact is almost imperceptible. It has faded to almost zero. But that But when you're looking at the cars traveling on that street in front of that development, most of those cars are not going to that development. They're going somewhere else, right? That's just traffic going by. What you're looking at is you're looking at the almost imperceptible impact that some other project had clear across town, multiplied by every house in the city. And as you start to get to the larger scales, what happens is those almost imperceptible impacts become the dominant force in the system. And that is why you get qualitatively different results depending on which direction you look at it. So if I'm trying to build, if I'm looking at the impact of one particular development, I will see fewer houses in this subdivision will result in less traffic. But those people have to go somewhere. And if those people go to the next development over, now they've got to travel a longer distance to get to where they're actually going. And they have to travel back in front of the development that you just sent them away from. Okay. So that's a really clear example of how scale independence makes this more complicated. Next slide. So one of the ways that the GMA looks at land is it looks at it in terms of what we call the differentiated landscape. So it really sort of says when you're going to plan for it, and the requirements associated with planning are very different depending on what part of the community you're in. So urban areas, urban cities, small towns, these are going to have urban densities, they're going to have urban services, they're going to be inside the urban growth boundary. You're going to plan for those very differently. Most of the growth is going to go there. Okay, rural lands, they're going to rely on rural services, they're going to have rural visual character. We're going to plan for them with the same level of intentionality that we plan for an urban area, but they're going to go very different. And then we're going to set aside resource lands and critical areas to meet other compelling state priorities. But this idea of a differentiated landscape, that we have at a statewide level, specific policies for different pieces of the land, is a fundamental component of the GMA. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the planning process itself. And the thing about a planning process, as you're aware of, is it's never a decision. It's always a set of nested decisions. And every decision exists in context. So the GMA requires first that there are countywide planning policies where cities and counties to get together and they hammer out how they're going to resolve regional issues. Things like regional distribution of share housing, regional transportation planning, how they're going to go about setting urban growth areas. These are all things cities and counties are required to resolve at the regional level through countywide planning policies. Then based on those, the local governments actually develop the comprehensive plan that you think of. Once the comprehensive plan is done, then comes the implementation process. And then comes the two levers that are the main drivers that come out of the comprehensive plan. This is how you implement your comprehensive plan. It is a combination of what you allow, how you use your regulatory authority through your development regulations, and how you use your investment authority in terms of the capital investment decisions you made. And the art of implementing your comprehensive plan is really the art of using your capital facilities planning and your regulatory authority to work in tandem. It's like a backhoe. If you pull one lever and not the other, you're just going to go in circles. You've got to be working these two tools in tandem. And that's how you get to actually guide what actually happens on the ground through the project development process. Next slide. So what's actually in a comprehensive plan when you look at it? If you look at a comprehensive plan, you'll see that the elements in the individual plan, they have some similarities, okay? They've got goals and policies, okay? What we're trying to accomplish, what the community expects, what's the larger vision. And then you've got a series of relevant facts that really constrain our decisions, okay? You've got to do inventories. What do we have right now? What kind of analysis can we draw from what we know about forecasts, what we know about the inventories, to tell us what are the opportunities and constraints we have in order to achieve the vision we've laid out, And then based on that, you make some decisions about what strategies are we going to deploy, what commitments are we going to make, how are we going to achieve it. So if I could describe the comprehensive plan in the fewest words as possible, it would be 2 words: disciplined imagination. The imagination to define a future that is compelling for the community at large, and the discipline to look at the situation with enough analytical rigor that you can determine what is a realistic and feasible path to achieving that vision. Next slide. So there are some specific requirements associated with transportation. These are some of the critical decisions you have to make. First of all, after you've done your inventory, after you've got your forecast, you have to decide, what are you actually trying to achieve? What is the public expectation around that? And that drives into the setting of level of service, okay? That is an analytical document, but it is an analytical statement of a value choice that a community has made, okay? That's not an engineer, the level of service you set is not an engineering decision, it is a policy decision, okay? And among the considerations you are going to look at is sort of, how are you going to measure it? How are you going to communicate the results? How do you create a feedback loop between the public expectations you make, the kinds of investments you want to make, and what the public actually values? Yeah, that's very right. The way the highway capacity manual envisions it and the way GMA envisions it are fundamentally different. And it's because the GMA doesn't require that you set it in a specific way. It requires that you have a specific measurable set of expectations, and that as you move forward, once you've set that expectation, that your plan provides a reasonable and feasible means of meeting that expectation. So the concurrency requirement is really a truth in advertising requirement. It's a no pretending requirement. Most of the capital, facility, and transportation planning requirements in the GMA are really about making sure that we're not pretending we're going to implement our land use element, but we're having difficult conversations and we're creating feedback loops between our financing system, our project development system, and the community we're trying to build. Next slide. The next requirement I want to talk about is talk about the identification of system needs. And it's really a question of, where do projects come from? And one of the things you need to do as you're developing a transportation element, or as you're developing a capital facilities element, incidentally, is you have to have what's called an identification of system needs. And this is where you say, okay, here's what we need to build, or here's what we need to accomplish over the next 20 years in order to realize our growth strategy. And it's a combination of existing deficiencies, so you get that from your inventory, your goals and policies, and external mandates. So the Americans with Disabilities Act says you got to have curb cuts, okay? That's a deficiency in the existing system. A new stormwater manual comes out. Your roads are not managing stormwater the way the new manual calls for. That's an existing deficiency, okay? The other thing you've got to do is you've got to maintain the system you already built, okay? So you've got an asset management system, and your asset management system says this is the schedule you need to optimize system preservation. So that's going to generate system preservation needs. And then you've got the needs resulting from new growth. That comes from the level of service you've set, your traffic forecast, and your land use system. All of these things combined generates the system needs, and those needs are going to be met through a combination of capital projects, programs you develop, and regulations you develop. And the critical thing here to know is that where the need for a project comes from governs what available funding sources you can use. So a lot of grant programs, they won't deal with new growth, okay? If you've got impact fees and you're charging money for impact fees, you can't spend those impact fees on maintenance or on clearing existing deficiencies. There has to be a rational nexus between the need resulting from new growth and the project you're going to build with those impact fees. And if you've ever talked to a public works director, Most of them spend more time dealing with financial packaging than they do with engineering. Okay, that's the job of a public works director, is how do we package those, and where the needs come from really drive the color of money that you can use when you're packaging an individual project. And that comes from this process of identifying system needs. It's about making that connection between what we're trying to achieve and the projects we're actually building. Next slide. The last thing I want to talk about here is I want to talk about the reassessment process. It's a really small word. It doesn't seem like that it would be that big a thing, but it's huge. Okay, reassessment is the process of creating feedback loops, especially creating feedback loops between your transportation planning system, your land use and growth strategy, and revenue and finances. Okay, and if there's one of the most important parts of the reassessment process is assessing whether or not we can afford to build the system we're planning for and whether we can continue to maintain it over time. That reassessment is built in. The day of reckoning for reassessment really comes during the periodic update process, and that's coming up right now. The Central Puget Sound counties are already starting that process. The rest of Western Washington will be coming a year later, and then 26 and 27 it'll be moving over to the east side. So this is our window of opportunity, and we're going to be doing workshops on the plan review process for local governments and for state agency folks who are going to be engaging in this process. But this is the point where the feedback loops start. And this is a good time as people are working through how are we going to accommodate population over the next 20 years. This is the part where we need to be engaging with them about here's how you need to be thinking about transportation investments. Here's what you can reasonably expect from the state transportation system. And if you're dropping a lot of demand onto the state transportation system that we can't afford to meet, we're going to be having a tough conversation about how are we going to about whether that's going to work and whether that you've got a feasible strategy or not. This is the time to be having that conversation. Next slide. So the last few things I want to leave you with here. First one, okay, when you're thinking about land use and transportation, make sure the system has feedback loops, that you're able to use the transportation system as a lever to generate the kind of community you want, and to make sure you're using your land use system as a lever to manage the need for and demand for transportation. The next thing is when you're thinking about the nature and the impact of a project, pay very close attention to location. Okay, where the project is located in metropolitan space is going to drive the ultimate impact it has on the regional system far more than any elements of the individual design. The third thing is, if you want to say no to something, you got to say yes to something else. It's really critical that we're saying yes to the right things. Okay, centrally located projects, even when they're high density projects, have far less impact on the regional system than a project that's further out, because the further it is away from everything else, the longer the average trip length and the more VMT per unit you're going to have. Okay, that is the strongest driver of transportation at a metropolitan scale. And the last thing to remember is that don't think of your role as a regulator, all right? You're an equity partner. You're managing the investments the state is making in transportation. And once somebody has built that project, we have an ongoing permanent obligation to maintain that system, okay? We have got skin in this game and we've got to act like it. So that's what I've got. I'm open for questions if you want to do questions now. How do you want to do that, Celeste?
Thank you, Dave. That was fantastic. We're going to do questions via the chat because we do have such a packed agenda today.
All right.
So if you have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. And Dave, if you're able to continue on and with us and post answers there, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I got all day.
Awesome. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So in addition to the Growth Management Act, the legislature has identified that public investment in transportation should support achievement of the policy goals of safety, preservation, economic vitality, mobility, environment, and stewardship per RCW 4704-280. WSDOT is specifically directed by the legislature to balance system safety and convenience to accommodate all users of the transportation system, develop strategies to gradually reduce per capita vehicle miles traveled, consider demand management tools, promote integrated multimodal planning, and design environmentally sustainable and context-sensitive transportation systems per RCW 4701-078. The department is further directed to reduce per capita vehicle miles traveled in RCW 4701-440. Vehicle travel, as we've talked about, is the most significant source of greenhouse gases in Washington State, and the state has committed to greenhouse gas reduction targets in RCW 70A 45-020. WSDOT employees are directed to take actions that sustain economic, environmental, and societal prosperity for current and future generations through a focus on energy efficiency, pollution reduction, and enhanced resilience in Secretary's Executive Order E111300. WSDOT is also directed to reduce environmental and health disparities and achieve environmental justice in the agency's programs in RCW 70A02. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry. We can't hear you, Terry. Oh, your audio is not working. All right, so we're going to do a quiz, and it's here at Menti. So log into Menti, and all right, so get ready. There we go. So question 1, get logged in. Looks like we got lots of players today for our quiz. You want to answer fast to get the most points. What is the overarching goal of land use and transportation integration? Is it thriving communities, WSDOT rules the world, or drivers reach their destinations more quickly? Get your answers in. Countdown, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. All right, got a lot of right answers there. Thriving communities, yes. Looks like Lowell is at the top of the leaderboard. All right, I'm gonna go to our next question. Get ready to answer fast. How many RCWs directly or indirectly establish an expectation that land use and transportation should be coordinated? Is it 0, 2, or more than 5? All 3, 2, 1. Time's up. All right, got a lot of right answers there. Nice work. All right, our last, let's see who's at the leaderboard. Looks like MCN nudged up to the top. All right, last question here. You ready to answer fast? What are the fundamental challenges with overdependence on vehicles? Geometry and equity, safety, economy, and sustainability, or all the above? Here we go, 3, 2, 1, time's up. All right, nice work. Yes, all the above. Okay. And who is our winner for bragging rights? Okay, nice job, MCN. All right, That was a lot of material in a short amount of time. We want you to stand up at your desk. Do not leave, but stand up and stretch for 1 minute. And then we're going to move on to the next part of our program. All right, hopefully you're feeling limbered up and ready to go. We're gonna move on to the next slide, please, Terry. All right. So we've gone over the broad value of integrating transportation and land use and the statutory and policy context that supports this approach. But how do we put these broad concepts into practice? In these next set of slides, I will be sharing a set of guiding principles intended to create a framework for effective action that will lead us towards those goals in all the areas where our work touches the interface between transportation and land use. For any one person within the agency, your work may touch many or only a small subset of these principles. These principles are draft and are still subject to change and refinement. They have, however, gone through significant development. In September 2020, earlier version of these principles received support from Secretary Millar and Assistant Secretary Leiser and were shared with the broader executive leadership team. Since then, I've been working with subject matter experts and practitioners across the agency to beta test and refine these principles. As I go through the principles, Anna will continue to share in the chat, including some of the WSDOT staff who are leading efforts that relate to the principles, as well as related resources. Next slide. Principle 1, remove barriers to infill development. Encourage development that adds to the diversity of origins and destinations. Partner with cities, counties, Department of Commerce, and other state agencies, tribes, and others to proactively remove barriers to adding housing, employment, and services within existing developed areas. For example, by removing requirements for motor vehicle infrastructure, such as parking, vehicle lanes, highway capacity manual, level of service mitigations, etc., and strategic management of curb space. Next slide. 2, reduce environmental and health disparities. Prioritize transportation investments that reduce disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental effects against historically overburdened communities and vulnerable populations. Harms include exposure to air pollution and other environmental pollutants, crash exposure, disproportionate policing, and restricted access to high-quality employment, education, healthy food, healthcare services, safe housing, arts and culture offerings, and social opportunities necessary to achieve optimal health outcomes. Partner with others to pair provision of affordable housing, transportation options, and anti-displacement actions with investments. Next slide. 3, road versus street classification. Implement a clear delineation of road and street types that seeks to eliminate the type of high-speed managed access routes that have been found to discourage active transportation and compact development and also result in relatively inferior service for all travel modes. With this delineation, facilities would be transitioned to 1, highway, limited access highways with interchanges for vehicle access. 2, distributor road, managed access routes that are restrictive in property access and are intended for higher vehicle speeds for traveling between population centers. 3, access street, managed access highways in population centers that are complete streets intentionally designed for lower vehicle speeds. Next slide. 4, implement the state's safe system approach. Implement that approach to providing and maintaining transportation facilities that acknowledges death and serious injury are unacceptable, that humans are vulnerable and make mistakes, and takes a proactive approach that incorporates redundancy. On access streets, take proactive measures to encourage lower driving speeds. On distributor roads, provide a greater level of separation and/or barriers to protect vulnerable users. Next slide. 5, complete active transportation networks. For all highway projects, including fish passage barrier removal projects and resurfacing projects, identifying missing active transportation network links, whether they're absent or not maintained and operated to encourage safe use, as baseline needs, and improve the active transportation facilities. Next slide. 6, invite active trips. Maximize walking, rolling, and cycling trip making by providing active transportation facilities that provide users with a low level of traffic stress in accordance with agency policy, such that the performance outcomes are accessible, designed in accordance with the ADA, cohesive, where all links in the vicinity of the project are present and they each provide the appropriate level of traffic stress, direct, avoiding any significant out-of-direction travel for all active transportation modes, safe, developed in accordance with safe system principles, and comfortable and attractive, shaded and shielded by trees, with pleasant noise levels and air quality, visually interesting settings. Next slide. 7, prioritize transit, HOV, and freight. On all highway types, prioritize the reliability of transit, high occupancy vehicles, and freight over general purpose travel. Avoid increasing risk to vulnerable users by over-designing for large vehicles. Transit functions best when it can quickly and reliably serve destinations that are located along a linear path, short travel time apart, and surrounded by a high-quality active transportation network. Freight has specific needs that should be considered and addressed, including freight parking, protection of industrial areas from incompatible uses, and reducing the risks of conflicts with vulnerable users. Next slide. 8, make the most of existing transportation infrastructure. When more people are able to meet their daily needs through walking, bicycling, and taking transit, this reduces the competition for roadway space compared to when they are compelled to drive to their destinations. Therefore, use existing investments in paved areas, highways, park and ride lots, to more efficiently move people by reallocating space from current general purpose and single occupant vehicle use to high occupant vehicle, transit, and active transportation use, depending on context and potential demand. Do this to complete absent or deficient networks or in response to requests by transit agencies and other local agencies. Next slide. 9, facilitate utilities that communities need. Work with utility providers to advance transportation efficiency and incentivize compact development. Per RCW 47-44-160, develop a dig once policy that proactively provides broadband facility owners with information about planned state highway projects to enable collaboration between broadband facility owners and the department. Minimize administrative burdens, delays, and uncertainties associated with utility permits or franchises for infrastructure upgrades in support of densification of development in existing communities to help them become more transportation efficient, and seek to integrate the development of trails that contribute to the overall plan for a complete active transportation network into utility projects and corridors. Next slide. And
this is the 5th video in my Strongtown series. You don't need to watch the others to understand this one, but it might provide some context. If you live in the US or Canada, then this will certainly look familiar to you. Multiple lanes of car traffic, wide highway-sized lanes, giant signs, traffic lights, parking lots, lots of driveways and side streets with traffic merging in and out, and a place that's nearly impossible to cross as a pedestrian. There isn't even a sidewalk here. These are what Strongtowns refers to as stroads, which is a horrible name, and that's intentional because these are horrible places. Stroads are a street-road hybrid, and they are dangerous, expensive, and ineffective. I'll get to those issues in a moment, but first, let's talk about the difference between a street and a road, according to Strongtowns. This is a road. It is a high-speed connection between two places. Because of the high speeds involved, there are several safety features. The lanes are wide and forgiving so that vehicles do not bump into each other. The road is as straight as possible, and when curves are necessary, they're designed to be gentle, making it easy to drive along. The area next to the road, called the clear zone, is free of any obstacles that could be hit, just in case a vehicle runs off the road. The signs are very large, designed to be read from a distance and at high speeds. And entrances and exits are few and far between because the road is designed to keep vehicles at a high speed for as long as possible to minimize travel times. Roads are important. We need roads, though I personally prefer my roads to have rails. This is a street. It is a complex environment where life in the city happens. Buildings are placed right next to the sidewalk to be easily accessible by people walking, and it gives a sense of space, almost like an outdoor room. This is a place that feels comfortable to be in, so you find people here. There are many entrances and exits to and from the street, and there may also be street parking for vehicles and deliveries. This is an environment meant for slow speeds because this is a destination, not a thoroughfare. High-speed traffic is not compatible with lots of human activity, so vehicle speeds are reduced. Everything on the street is at a human scale. It's designed to be inviting, encouraging people to walk, to window shop, or to just sit and watch the world go by. The street is designed to get the most value out of the space available. Streets are very important, and we definitely need streets. A stroad, on the other hand, is neither of these things. Just like how a futon converts from a terrible uncomfortable couch to a terrible uncomfortable bed, the stroad is the futon of transportation. It is a street that is designed like a road, and in doing so, it fails at being good at either one. The stroad fails at being a street. There are many driveways to businesses and homes like you'd find on a street, but mixed with multiple highway-sized lanes. This mixes high speeds with many points of conflict. Watch over this white car turning, and this cyclist. Are there any cars coming out of these driveways? Unlike a street, stroads are hostile to people outside of a car. There are lots of motor vehicles and speeds are high, so walking or cycling feels uncomfortable and dangerous. There are long distances between places, and there are often large parking lots that need to be crossed before getting anywhere. And it's basically impossible to cross the stroad except by walking to a traffic signal and waiting. The signs are large and meant to be read while driving, which feels really out of scale if you're walking there. And often trees have been removed from the clear zone, making the environment even more uninviting if you're not in a car. Somehow, though, painted bicycle gutters are still okay in the clear zone. Traffic engineers are concerned about drivers hitting a tree. Hitting a cyclist is expected. This is clearly a place for cars, so it's unsurprising that pretty much everyone drives here. Trust me, it sucks to walk down this stroad. But these environments are ugly anyway. Nobody cares about these places and nobody wants to spend any time here. Cities in the US and Canada are covered in terrible non-places like this. Places you go because you have to, not because you want to. Nobody actually sits and watches the world go by on this bench. But the stroad fails at being a road too. The lanes are wide and there are a lot of them. You're surrounded by asphalt, but you can't actually get anywhere quickly like you can with a road. There are cars constantly changing lanes and going in and out of the stroad, slowing down traffic and introducing many points of conflict that require drivers to constantly slow down to avoid a collision. Traffic volumes can be quite high on stroads because there are no viable alternatives to driving. Distances are too far to walk and it's too unsafe to cycle. And since public transit gets stuck in traffic anyway, only the poor and the desperate will take the bus. So everyone drives. But because there are so many crossroads, entrances, and exits to the stroad, traffic lights are required, meaning drivers are constantly stopping at red lights. And because speeds are high, light timings need to be very long, leading to traffic signal-induced congestion. Nobody is getting anywhere quickly on a stroad. All of these elements make stroads unsafe as well, and the majority of fatal crashes within cities happen on stroads. They are especially dangerous to people walking and cycling.
Grammarly does more than catch errors. With Grammarly, you can find
The wide and straight design of highways were designed that way to make them safe for high-speed traffic. But the stroad to hell is paved with good intentions. On a stroad, these wide highway-like designs encourage drivers to drive quickly. But combining that with traffic turning in and out of driveways and lots of four-way junctions makes this the most dangerous type of urban driving possible. This is an inherently unsafe way to design a road, and is part of the reason why the US has the most dangerous roads of any developed country. For example, during the coronavirus lockdowns in the first 9 months of 2020, car volumes in the US dropped significantly. But despite an estimated 355 billion fewer miles driven, fatal crashes per mile actually increased by up to 34%. This brings us to the sad truth, that the only reason these unsafe American roads aren't killing even more people regularly is because they're usually so jammed up with traffic that drivers can't get going fast enough to kill each other. And finally, stroads are really expensive. Because stroads are built to a highway standard, their lanes are very wide and there are never less than 4 lanes. Plus, there's normally extra space for shoulders and clear zones at the side of the road too. Because stroads try to be streets, there are many entrances and exits, so many turning lanes are required. But because of the high speeds, turning lanes are much longer than on a street, taking up even more space. And as traffic increases even more, due to traffic entering and exiting the stroad, the city will install another traffic signal for $750,000. All of this means that a stroad is much bigger than a road that would carry the same amount of traffic, and significantly larger than a street that would have the same number of businesses and houses along it. As the size of the stroad increases, there are several other costs incurred. High-speed stroads need to be flat, so the area that needs to be graded increases. Land may need to be purchased from residents to widen the stroad and destroy their property values. By the way, do you think this girl is waiting to cross this 5-lane stroad? Flood protection infrastructure becomes much more expensive due to the impermeable surfaces, and there's a huge amount of asphalt and traffic control systems to maintain. And of course, because everyone drives, large parts of the landscape need to be dedicated to parking lots, meaning everything is inherently spread out in low density. Parking lots don't employ anyone, and they don't earn much tax revenue either. A stroad environment is significantly less financially productive than a street, but with significantly more infrastructure. The result is a mix of high cost per area maintenance expenses combined with low value per acre tax revenue, which makes these stroad environments a net negative for cities. These places are literally putting American cities on the stroad to financial ruin, and they're doing it while being dangerous, ugly, and ultimately ineffective at actually moving people. The stroad fails at every metric, but it's the default setting for transportation design almost everywhere in the US and Canada. So what's the alternative? Well, Strongtowns advocates for one of two things. First, you can convert a stroad into a road. This means limiting access to the stroad, accessing businesses and neighborhoods from side streets. Painted bicycle gutters need to be removed because moving vehicles is the primary objective of a road. People can still walk or cycle, but these paths need to be completely separated from the flow of traffic. In this way, the stroad becomes a road, a high-speed connection between two places. The other alternative is to turn the stroad into a street. For this, the lanes need to be narrowed and parking needs to be moved to the curb or behind buildings, and the buildings themselves need to be built closer to the street. Everything needs to be brought down to a human scale, making it inviting to people and getting more value from the space available. This isn't a hypothetical, and we don't have to imagine what this would look like, because the Netherlands has already done it, just with 3 types of infrastructure instead of the 2 proposed by Strongtowns. You will almost never find a stroad here, because in the 1990s, the Dutch adopted the concept of sustainable traffic safety. And one of the key pillars of this program was that every road and street in the Netherlands has to be classified and designated as one of the following 3 options. The first is a stroomweg, which is pretty straightforward. It is a motorway or highway. I think everyone is familiar with these, so I won't spend too much time on it. But the important thing here is that there are no traffic controls. Cars enter and exit through merge lanes, and you will never find a traffic light or roundabout on a stroomweg. Highways should also go around cities and never through cities. I'm looking at you, Cincinnati. Actually, that's not fair, because basically all American cities did this. Thankfully, the plan to do this to Amsterdam was unsuccessful. Moving one level down is the Gebiedsontsluitingsweg. the distributor road. These are the connectors between highways and streets. There may be entrances and exits to other streets and roads, but driveways to houses or businesses are avoided as much as possible. And if traffic controls are necessary, then roundabouts are preferred, unless traffic volumes require a traffic light. I'm going to refer to these as roads. Finally, there's the Erftoegangsweg, the neighborhood access street. These are the end destinations for journeys, the places where people live, work, shop, relax, and so on. I'm going to refer to these as streets. Streets are designed to be low speed with a speed limit of no more than 30 kilometers per hour, and they almost never have more than one motor vehicle lane per direction. In many cases, vehicle speeds are slow enough that separated bicycle infrastructure is not required, though bicycle paths may still be used to purposefully narrow the street, constraining the space available for motor vehicles. The street network is designed to discourage through traffic by cars, either through traffic calming or by explicitly blocking cars while still allowing walking, cycling, and public transit to take the most direct route. I've talked about this before in my invisible infrastructure video, where I show a typical trip by bicycle through the street network compared to the very different route by road that is taken when driving. Once you learn about these three types of road in the Netherlands, what I'm unofficially calling highways, roads, and streets, it's really interesting to drive around and see which type you're on. This is a street. This is a road. This is a street. This is a road. This is a road with streets on either side to access houses. Since this is a relatively recent concept, only implemented about 30 years ago, the best place to see this in action is in newer developments. Here we are driving on a road outside the town of Nieuwleusen. This road is designed to move vehicles, so there is no direct access to adjacent properties. The homes and businesses are accessed by streets on the right and left side, and the road is mostly accessed by roundabout. As we exit the roundabout into this industrial park, the
Nada elimina más virus en más superficies que el Lysol Disinfecting Spray.
the road turns into a street where cars and trucks can access the warehouses and industrial facilities safely and efficiently without disrupting traffic on the road. It's also very interesting to see where one type turns into another. This is clearly a street, a residential street in Amsterdam. There is parking on either side, and there are many side streets branching off. There are no traffic lights or stop signs. Speeds are low here, so intersections are unmarked, and you give priority to any vehicle coming from the right. I've talked about this before in my video about stop signs. This street has a brick road surface, speed bumps, and other traffic calming measures to slow down traffic. The speed limit is 30 kilometers an hour, and bicycle and motor vehicle traffic is mixed. But as we travel down this street, we come to a set of traffic lights, and here is where this street becomes a road. The bicycle path becomes totally separated from motor vehicle traffic. There's no more street parking. The road surface is made of smooth asphalt, and there's a median separating the traffic lanes. There are buildings on either side, but crucially, they cannot be accessed by this road because turning traffic would be inefficient and unsafe. As we travel down this road a little farther, we can see here it turns back into a street. Here's another example in the suburb of Amstelveen. The right-of-way is about 22 meters, which in the US or Canada would be at least a 4-lane road with center turning lane. But despite the space available, there's only one lane of motor vehicle traffic in each direction here, and the lanes are narrow, which encourages drivers to drive slower. Single-lane roads are much safer because cars changing lanes introduces points of conflict between vehicles, and they are easier for pedestrians to cross. This also frees up space on both sides for car parking, a bicycle path, and a sidewalk. There are multiple other streets intersecting with this one, bringing traffic in and out of the street. A few meters along, this street starts to turn into a road. Here you can see that access to the houses and parking on the right-hand side are provided by a small side street running parallel to the road, so that through traffic does not compete with drivers going in and out of parking spaces. Travel along this road a little farther, and the street has completely turned into a road. There is a stoplight, multiple lanes of motor vehicle traffic, and an entrance to a highway. The bicycle path is two-way and isolated completely from the road. A little farther along, this road becomes quite interesting. Here, there are several houses, but instead of being accessed directly, as they would be on a strode, they're accessible by a two-way side street, which was made purposefully narrow to slow down drivers. This also provides a safe alternative for people cycling. The road itself is only 2 lanes for car traffic, with turning lanes when necessary. 1 lane has been reserved as a bus lane, and there is a 2-way cycling path as well. It's also interesting to note that because dedicated bus lanes and bicycle paths are much more efficient at moving people than car lanes, this road configuration can actually transport more people than a typical strode. The Netherlands didn't change this overnight, and this transition to roads and streets is not totally complete. There are still some streets here that carry too much through traffic, for example, but at least they're usually only 2 lanes wide. This change has happened slowly, with street and road redesigns spread out over the past 30 years. The first step, though, was identifying that there was a problem with road safety and road productivity and changing the design standards to match. It's time to face the fact that designing stroads as both a high-speed thoroughfare and a destination simply doesn't work. Stroads are dangerous and expensive, they destroy walkability, they make cycling dangerous and infeasible, and they don't work for drivers either. The US and Canada need to rethink the traffic engineering manuals that define urban spaces and start building productive streets and efficient roads. Then they can get on the road to recovery and benefit from fewer traffic deaths, more viable alternatives to driving, less traffic, and more financially productive cities. It's the end of the road for stroads. Good riddance.
I would now like to welcome our guests from City of Spokane and City of Bothell. Shauna Harshman is the manager of the Neighborhood Connectivity Initiatives for Spokane City Council, where she researches and recommends policy pertaining to transportation and land use. Shauna's colleague, Kara Odegaard, is the City Council Manager of Sustainable Initiatives for the City of Spokane. And Eddie Lowe is a 35-year veteran of the City of Bothell, where he is the Deputy Public Works Director, a role in which he is responsible for all aspects of the engineering, including oversight on planning, programming, capital projects, and the engineering permit activities related to land use applications. Welcome, Shauna, Kara, and Eddie. They'll be sharing examples of the work in their communities to integrate transportation and land use. And next slide, over to Shauna.
Hi, thank you everyone, and welcome. Really, the presentation to this point has set up exactly what I'm going to share, a few slides and a little bit of information on the work that we're doing in the City of Spokane in regards to land use and transportation. We can go to the next slide. Dave did a great job of kind of highlighting what some of that nexus opportunity is between those different plan types and then what we do with implementation. So foundational in the work that we're doing in the combination or the coordination between land use and transportation really starts with our comprehensive plan. And that comprehensive plan adopts by reference both our master pedestrian and master bikeway plans so that we really are integrating both our land use policies and multimodal transportation policies at that very high level. So currently, the City of Spokane is focusing quite extensively on transit-oriented design. So a few projects just to highlight from you on transit-oriented design and with an eye towards complete streets that the city is working on right now. One on the left of this screen is the Cincinnati Greenway. The City of Spokane has been doing quite a bit more greenway work over the past 2 years with the guidance and support of our Bicycle Advisory Board, so that we're really looking at that integration of automobile and bicycle users of the street facilities and locating those in residential neighborhoods where they make sense. So really paying attention to that context. in terms of complete streets and some additional coordination, just wanted to highlight one of the opportunities that we developed downtown on Post Street, which was essentially a street that can be used as a pedestrian alley, has ballards. We often program that space, and then during the week or when it's not being programmed, it's a local access street. So highlighting here what that looks like activated. And because we're here talking with WSDOT in terms of looking at some of our complete streets and transit-oriented design, wanted to take a look at some of those facilities that are in close proximity to some of the WSDOT facilities so that we can look at that partnership and collaboration between WSDOT and our municipality a little bit more and celebrate those successes, talk a little bit about our ongoing projects in a couple of instances, and take a look at some of the work that we've already done. So on the lower right slide here, you'll see an image of Brown and Third, where it has some of our very limited green paint in the city of Spokane. And if I could see Kara, I'm sure I would get a giggle out of her with that. It's a direction that we definitely want to fulfill more of, the green paint on streets, but it's a good start. So right here, we're under I-90. And this is actually quite an interesting connection from neighborhood down through downtown and in proximity to the freeway there. Works pretty well. The signage is really great, actually. Next slide. Could we go to the next? Thank you. So a couple other highlights of complete streets, although potentially a professor of transportation engineering might nitpick at some of the elements that are missing. However, Main Street and Division downtown is a really active, vibrant space for both pedestrians. You can see the broad crosswalk there, as well as the pedestrian islands with seating and planting, and most recently, street murals and bicycle parking, um, all in a very vibrant commercial space that has activation throughout the day and into the evening. So it really has some of the plantings and accessibility and activation that we really look for as a model in complete streets. So we wanted to share this little piece with you, and this will be going through some modification as the city line, the high performance, high frequency transit line through central Spokane comes through, but that will be in the future, and we'll still maintain many of these elements. Next slide. Could we go to the next slide?
Sorry, I'm clicking. There must be a lag.
That's okay. The other things that we are working on right now are a series of transit-oriented development studies. One of those, we have partnered with WSDOT and Spokane County and SRTC, as well as STA, on the Division Street corridor study, and that's called Division Connects. And phase one of that was really looking at how to reimagine that street in terms of not just transit, but multimodal access as well. So we evaluated appropriate locations for potential future cycle track, how to site other bicycle facilities, perhaps not on the highway itself. I think that would be an example of a non-functioning strode, according to our last video. And then the improvements that can be made both to the adjacent land use and the pedestrian environment and really just the street environment. And that study is entering phase 2 right now, which is going to be diving in more high level on the land use components and doing that high level community visioning about what land use changes could support the future vision of transforming this corridor into something that is really productive and effective and efficient for all transportation users. So this is one of the transit-oriented design studies that we're doing. We're also doing a couple of other smaller transit-oriented design studies looking at land uses along high-performance transit in what we call the city line, connecting one of our most dense urban neighborhoods outside of downtown to community college. And so we're looking at how to better align land use in an opportunity-rich environment where we have great transit service, and not just how to look at the land use and density there also, but we're also looking at those other connections for pedestrians, for bicycles, and making sure that we have access and equitable access to these transportation facilities. So this is laced throughout the comprehensive plan, the pedestrian plan, and the bicycle master plan. And now we're finally, I know it sounds like we're studying and that's not really implementing, but just to get to the point where we are engaging in all of these transit-oriented design studies recognizes the relationship between land use and transportation, and that we need to meld those to be effective going forward. Next slide. So I did just, because I was just talking about Division Connects, wanted to throw that slide in there of the project area. It's a very large corridor that we are attempting to reimagine that better land use and transportation connection to transform it from about a 3-mile strip mall into something that has meaning and vision and value for more people in our community. And so what's next for the city of Spokane is finishing up a couple of these studies, digging into the policy that Dave mentioned to really meld together the policy with the implementation and those projects to move forward. So that is what we're going to do entering phase 2 of Division Connects. We're entering a second transit-oriented design on another in another area of town, and we are going to continue to build out those studies and begin to build those facilities to implement that vision. Next slide. So not everything is rosy. We're doing good work. We're making good progress. But as all of you know, we always want to do more, always want to be better. And so in the spirit of that, and that we're here with WSDOT, one of the facilities that we could collaborate on the visioning and the redesign of is really Spokane Falls Boulevard and Division. And I think these diagrams or pictures with the arrows really highlight what some of the challenges are here. Wide lanes of traffic, multiple lanes of traffic coming in from 3 different places, a bicycle lane that where does it go? I'm not sure. That where are the pedestrian facilities? How do they get us to where we actually need to go in relation to all of these activity centers? On the right-hand side of the picture on the left, you'll see that's the convention center. So this is in the urban core downtown. This is where we have a tremendous number of visitors and tourists and activity. And we've got a highway facility coming into downtown that we're trying to balance all of these elements in. Oh, I was also sorry seeing comments popping up and it wasn't anything to answer. So this is one of those areas where we, would work with WSDOT as a partner to help continue to improve this land use and transportation component. And we've been working with WSDOT in the Division study in reimagining the 195 corridor, in working in East Central to do placemaking as we're doing the North Spokane corridor work. And so from my perspective as the manager of neighborhood connectivity with the city, we have a great collaborative relationship working on a lot of projects. And frankly, we've got more projects on the books and coming up, and probably additional projects that we haven't even thought about yet that we are excited to partner with WSDOT on, and really, frankly, very excited to see that WSDOT is focusing on this land use and transportation integration and corridor, and recognizing how important all of these pieces are in the overall system. I think that is the last slide, but there may be one more. Nope. We just wanted to reiterate, Karen and I did, that our goal in the work that we're doing to integrate transportation and land use at the city really rests right here: walkable, livable, sustainable communities for everyone in our community. And until we get to that, we still have work to do and collaboration to move forward on. So I think I kept that fairly tight. If we have questions now or at the end, I'm not sure how you want to handle that.
Thank you, Shauna. That was great. If people have questions for Shauna, please put them into the chat. And we're going to go to Eddie now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introductions, Celeste. And again, my name is Eddie Lowe. I'm with Bothell. I'm happy to be here to share Bothell's story on our efforts in creating a sustainable, walkable, and vibrant community, and providing many transportation choices. But thanks to the foresight of our City Council and the community vision, and I'm going to talk a little bit of how we, got there. So obviously, we all know that land use and transportation play a major role in the revitalization effort like downtown in Bothell. Next slide, please. A little bit about Bothell for those who are not familiar with the city. We're located north of Bellevue and just north on the northeast of Lake Washington. A little bit about you have the freeway running north-south on 405 coming through Bothell. We have the 522 from Seattle heading east and west to Bothell. And then we have the 527, for those who are familiar, from downtown Bothell. It goes up to Everett heading north. So a couple of highlights of Bothell are, we're located in King County and Snohomish County. And we do have the University of Washington Bothell campus and the Cascadia College joint campus with about 8,000 students and expected to grow to 10,000 students. And the rest of the stuff on the slide, you can read about it. Next slide, please. So this one is sort of a busy map showing the downtown sub area. One highlight is the blue area. That's where the college campus of University of Washington, Bothell and Cascadia are located. And then you see a lot of colored area with the lower street grid system in the middle part of it. And that's where downtown, the core of downtown is. And that's where Main Street will connect from 522 all the way to the campus. So I'm not going to read all the other modes of transportation the update consists of, but wanted to highlight transit. And because Bothell is in 2 counties, we actually have 3 transit agencies serving Bothell. And there are the Sound Transit, which is the regional transit agency. I'll talk a little bit more about Sound Transit investment later. Then we have King County Metro. And then we have the Snohomish County Community Transit serving Bothell. Next slide, please. A little bit about the downtown revitalization that Bothell went through. The left picture shows the downtown effort. The plan was adopted in 2009, about 12 years ago. And the right picture shows kind of the vision of what the artist's rendering of what the main downtown would transform to. Next slide, please. This map shows where the city started with $200 million of an investment on infrastructure, and that includes, street, water, sewer, and all the other facilities. And that spurred more than $800 million of private development in downtown area. As you can see, the map is all scattered with all the developments. In terms of statistic, the update on the downtown sub-area plan calls for 2,750 new dwellings, and as of today, we have 1,900 dwelling units been built. It calls for 400,000 square feet of retail, and as of today, we have 1,700 square foot of, 170,000 square foot of retail that have been built, and then it calls for 250,000 square feet of office, and as of today, we have 150,000 square feet have been built. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the transit that the city has leveraged in our effort, because we can build more lanes, and we're trying to use transit as a way for the future. So we have the Sound Transit investment coming into Bothell. As you know, the voters in this area approved over $50 billion of package of regional transit for Sound Transit. So the map sort of on the right shows sort of the two key areas I wanted to highlight: the 405 BRT, which runs from Burien to the south, all the way to Linwood to the north through Bothell. Then you have the other one, which is also the orange, kind of a yellow-orange line, colored line, which runs from the I-5 light rail transit in Shoreline Station all the way to Bothell. Again, both these BRT service are going to meet in Bothell, and the transit hub in Bothell is located next to the UW Bothell and Cascadia College campus. So again, these two BRTs are the first for Sound Transit, and they are planned to start service in 2026 and 2027. Then, we obviously have the other two BRTs that are coming to town, which is the King County Metro Transit, Rapid Ride, and then the Community Transit Swift Line. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the two complete street concepts that the city implemented in the downtown area. First one is the multi-way boulevard. That the left image shows the image of the rendering, what it looks like, and the right image shows the cross-section of the multi-way boulevard. Now, we call the boulevard. It's sort of unique in the sense that this project is actually on 527, and it carries up to 30,000 ADT for the future build-out. Now, the cross-section, as we saw in some of the previous presentation, and about not being a stroad, but trying to get to a road. And so it has a 4-lane in the middle with turn lanes, and the slower access lane that fronts both sides of the street. Now, other features are significant. You have wide sidewalks, street trees, rain gardens, decorative lighting, benches, and the bike racks, which sort of the slower lane to the side of the street. Next slide, please. A little bit more picture about what the corridor looks like. If you can turn on to the next slide. So this shows sort of the rendering of the artist, and then the next slide shows what has happened since the comp plan has been adopted, and it does shows the multi-way boulevard running the left to right. You can see all the street trees and the lower slow lanes and the parking lane of the main thoroughfare. Next slide, please. This one talks a little bit about the historic Main Street, and this is the second concept that the city did, sort of a complete street, but the focus there was the flex zone for Main Street, the historic Main Street, and it's important to retain this historic nature while revitalization and redeveloping the remainder of downtown. Unlike the multi-way boulevard, the concept has a flex zone, which allows the parking and also be converted for use of expanded zone for sidewalk cafe, dining, and other activities. Much wider sidewalk, 2-lane roadway, slow, and sort of very slow in this downtown environment. Some of the other features are planter boxes, street trees, and bike racks, and wayfinding and kiosks along this historic downtown. Now, the main street is closed periodically for many street fairs in the summers for Bothell. We have special events like 4th of July parade, Oktoberfest, and Christmas holidays, and so on. Next slide, please. This one shows a little bit about what happened to the multi-way boulevard where development, we transformed Anderson School to be sort of a much more, it's got a theater, hotel, and the brew pub, and it's a very active development with the McMinimans. So this was very important to Bothell as well. Next slide, please. This shows sort of another development along the multi-way, and it's across from City Hall. Next slide, please. And the last one, the last slide is again some mixed use, which redeveloped basically across from the University of Washington Cascadia College. So this pretty much concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening to Bothell's story of small town perspectives with big plans, but some ideas to make a small town come alive with non-traditional transportation ideas. So that concludes my presentation. Again, and if there's any questions, feel free to, forward it to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie and Shauna and Kara. The next portion of our program is an opportunity for us to listen in on our city representatives chat with each other on a few questions about where they've seen the most progress on effective transportation and land use coordination, where there could be improvement, how WSDOT has been a good partner, and where there could be improvement. So looks like Eddie and Shauna have their cameras on. Kara, would you mind turning yours on too? Great. All right, take it away, cities.
Eddie, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Progress on effective transportation, and the land use coordination, I think one critical item that I wanted to recognize WSDOT on trying to be partners is their leadership to look at active transportation. Obviously, Complete Streets was one of those legislation that came out of the state, and I'm sure WSDOT has a lot to do with championing that as well. So this is becoming a critical piece for us to be engaged with the agencies to try to transform a lot of these state routes and local streets to get to these activities that I just described, opportunities for Bothell to move towards this. So those leadership was really important for us on that aspect of coordination. Anything from Spokane you could share your experience on it?
Absolutely. And then Kara probably has something on this as well. But I think one of the big turning points that I can point to was actually the method that Charquet brought forward with the North Spokane Corridor project in terms of the community engagement, working with Eastern Washington University's planning department and getting out into the community in a variety of ways and having those discussions that were centered on the North Spokane Corridor, but were really neighborhood in terms of what are our special places? What do we value? What do we want the neighborhood structure to really look like around this facility? And I think that pivot in terms of WSDOT being this enormous agency that is looking at community engagement and the land uses around their facility was really important for the city and helped shape some of the future studies and work and kind of justification for us to be able to do that in some of the other work that we have been doing since then. In the smaller transit-oriented design studies, and then that set a wonderful stage for what we're doing along the Division Street corridor, for example. So I think that just in the, 5 years that we have been really doing the community visioning and work around the North Spokane corridor, we've seen enormous progress in how we view that relationship within the city and then how we're doing our work. Do you want to add something though, Kara? Because
Sure,
you have a slightly different perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just really quickly piggyback onto what both Eddie and Shauna have mentioned already. I am not a planner, so I do not come here with that perspective. I've been working with the city for the past 2.5 years to adopt a pretty comprehensive update to our sustainability action plan that was just adopted by council this Monday. And we have quite a few transportation and land use strategies identified in that plan. And what I already heard Eddie say, and I think Shauna alluded to earlier, is that one of the things that is working the best between WSDOT and Spokane, from my perspective, is the relationship that we have with Shar and her team. They've been actively willing to participate. They come to our public workshops around, to help us understand and engage with the community about what's important and how we can move together forward on our shared goals and visions. We had a really interesting project in a few years ago where we did a pop-up protected bike lane along a pretty busy street in the University District. And I remember WSDOT came to help us envision that for a day-long workshop we had. So in my mind, the most important thing we can be doing is to help change the culture in Spokane on what streets and roadways are meant to be providing for our community, and re-envisioning it from the car-centric culture that we really have still in Spokane into a more walkable, bikeable, multimodal, livable city. So anyway, thank you for letting us participate in your workshop today.
Excellent. Where do you see the most need or opportunity for improving transportation and land use coordination?
Actually, I think that Kara just hit the nail on the head with that in terms of opportunity to educate and to engage the community and be able to change that narrative, change the understanding, and really, I think that is our next step. We're doing a lot of good work at the city. We're doing a lot of good partnership work, but it still is a matter of what people value and what they express that they value, and how we message and tell the story of this connection in a way that makes it meaningful and makes it make sense, so that the people in our community value it in the same way.
This Eddie here. I think as we're talking about, the conversations and the education component of this, is that we all have to be connecting to each other about what we're trying to achieve. I think local agency, particularly, we have a lot of work that we continue to do, and sometimes it's hard to have that connection with WSDOT. And in the case of Bothell, obviously, we have several major investments that are coming into town, and tremendous amount of coordination on the I-405 BRT, and also the express toll lane that are building on 405. All those impacts, community on it. And also, the BRT coming down 522, which is also a state route. So all that has been really critical piece of coordination and continuing to work with agencies. And fortunately, there's investment dollars been put on those yet. But what I see in the future is that that's not the end of it, because I think there's still many other parts of the state highway that's coming to town that requires to be reimagined, to think about how do we take from what we built the last 50, 60 years and trying to transform into the new generation. In Bothell Comp Plan update, I mean, we're trying to leverage the future technology, as in one of my item that I talked about was the autonomy vehicles that are coming down, technology. We have all the first and last mile, connections that we need to think about. So a lot of these state highways are being structured differently in the past, and it needs to be transformed. We're hoping the state can play a bigger role, or also a good partners in trying to transform some of these corridors so that we can, as the city and the state, eventually benefit from this urban compact, type of livable, vibrant, and great experience for the folks that lived here, that come here. They're looking for all these choices and the quality of life that we're all trying to promote. So there's still a lot to do, and I think clearly, WSDOT is going to have to play a big role in trying to help us get there.
Great. Any closing remarks on how WSDOT is being a good partner? I know you all touched on it already, and how we can be an even better partner, or any closing thoughts on the previous questions?
I'll just, oh, sorry, Eddie, go ahead.
I'll start with that a little bit. I saw a chat about the multi-way boulevard. How is it on the state route? And I want to tell a little story from a perspective of learning experience. So the city wanted to transform that to a multi-way boulevard, and it's a state highway. And we went to the state, and the state says, well, we can't do this because we don't have any guidelines to help you get there. So, but we were quite persistent on it. We did work through some of the hurdles on it, and eventually, in order to get there, we thought that we have to structurally change some of the mindset in WSDOT. And so the city eventually came up with the idea that we're going to we do a route jurisdiction transfer, basically to turn it from a state highway to a local street. And part of that came from the idea that CTAC did, which they took a portion of Highway 99, which is a state route, and converted to a local street. So we're able to get to the multi-way boulevard a lot quicker. If the city hasn't done that, our vision in downtown would not have been realized so quickly. I mean, think about in the last 10 years, we have really transformed Bothell downtown. If you were to drive Bothell, and for those folks who've been to Bothell, you'll see Bothell looking entirely different from what you saw many years ago. So this is sort of a not necessarily, I mean, those are the opportunities that we want to start thinking and WSDOT mindset to. And I'm glad that this education is continuing to bring people thinking about what we are building for in the future. So that's sort of a way that I think kind of a lesson learned and where we can go.
Shauna, did you want to?
Yeah, just real briefly, because I know we're a little bit tight on time here, but I think that with the City of Spokane and the WSDOT team that is here, what it all boils down to in terms of how they're being a good partner is that the communication is open and flowing, and really the coordination and collaboration is happening very strongly early and throughout the processes that we are working on together. And the fact that WSDOT has really stepped up to look at their facilities as part of a larger system within the city and taking a look at how that facility has real impacts on livability and quality of life is just one of the most important things, and it allows us to move forward with other partnership opportunities. The city and WSDOT are partnering on an application right now for a potential land bridge in East Central over I-90, a bifurcated neighborhood, and I think that that shows that the partnership is working and collaboration is working really well in terms of being an even better partner. I think that the communication continuing to grow and the relationship has to be maintained, it's easy to let relationships kind of ebb and flow and not build on the partnerships that you create. And so I think that I mean, I'll have to leave here in just a moment because WSDOT's going to come and present to City Council on updates for the North Spokane corridor, for example. And so it's that sort of communication and that sort of relationship building and back and forth that I think is going to help us get through projects that we're doing now and potentially even difficult projects in the future.
Thank you. Excellent wisdom and insights. Kara, did you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that I think going forward, how WSDOT might help us is to help communicate to the public this vision that we all have for more livable, walkable, sustainable cities and how transportation plays a part of that. And that's what I'd like to leave with.
Excellent. I wish we had 3 hours for this segment right here.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Shauna, Eddie, Kara. So continuing on that discussion on how WSDOT can be a good partner in integrating transportation land use, we're going to take a look at some of the ways that WSDOT currently influences land use. WSDOT's work to integrate land use and transportation decision making is not tied to a standalone program. Rather, it is an approach that touches multiple facets, both internal and external to the department, with the ultimate goal of reducing the overall demand for motorized transportation. The demands placed on our transportation system are strongly influenced by land use decisions, as we've been talking about. At the same time, the investments made in the transportation system influence land development. Land use and transportation are two sides of the same coin. When WSDOT constructs roadway capacity, that influences land use by inducing auto demand and changing land values along the corridor. WSDOT engages at varying levels of development and comprehensive plan review, utilizing tools in the Growth Management Act and State Environmental Policy Act. Driveway access permitting and utility accommodation impact land use, as do the decisions we make on multimodal performance trade-offs. We participate in partnerships with local jurisdictions, transit agencies, tribes, and others, and we share information externally and externally to advance state of the practice and the understanding for the constituents that we serve. Oh, next slide, please. As touched on earlier in today's session, land use integration is a practical solution to managing travel demand. And I'd now like to welcome Todd Carlson, Planning and Engineering Services Manager in Northwest Region's Mount Baker area, and Lori Lebowski, Planning Director for Southwest Region. They're going to share a smorgasbord of transportation land use integration examples from across the WSDOT regions with a bent toward brevity and a Pecha Kucha inspired formats. Todd and Lori, take it away.
Had to do a little different background here. This a little bit more interesting. Oh, we've got a mountain in yours, Lori. Well, as Celeste said, my name is Todd Carlson, and Lori Lebowski is. We're going to blast through a ton of work that's going on around the state, and we're going to emphasize how the regions are working collaboratively with all of our partners on practical solutions. And you can see the banner on the top. This is what we're kind of focusing on. I'm going to start with most of the things I'm going to be talking about are managing system assets and identifying needs. And you'll kind of notice as we progress through these slides, we'll get further down that ribbon. So we're going to go right back to Eastern Region, just like Shauna and we're talking about in Spokane. This reimagining process that Sharkey has been leading on US Division Street, entitled Division Connects, is a collaboration with partners that can maximize transportation land use synergy along the corridor. And I think that's the key, is it's synergy. It's about how does the land use and the transportation work together rather than apart. Once the US 395 North Spokane corridor is complete. I'll go back to the slide. Sorry, I'm going too slow, Terry. Once the North Spokane corridor is complete, there's a recognition that this north-south travel patterns will change in the city of Spokane. So WSDOT is partnering with all the partners, the MPO, the Spokane City and Transit, to reimagine the opportunities on the US 2 as a primary north-south route. Along with the high-performance transit route, active transportation corridors, the study is exploring land use as a means to maximize transportation land use synergy along the corridor. Next slide. In the other side of the state, in the Urban Mobility and Access and Management and Mobility Office, this is an effort to look at the concurrency provision of growth management. So early engagement in multimodal considerations on highways will benefit communities and the state. So WSDOT is advocating or advocated that PSRC, the MPO, address the highways of statewide significance concurrency exemption under the Growth Management Act. And the result is there is an action on page 80 of the plan to do just that, which is a very large issue, but one that they're taking on in Central Puget Sound. Next slide. And a continuation in the same office include they're working on considerations of land use characteristics and traffic models. And if anybody is on the call are traffic modelers, you'll know what I'm talking about. The four-step model is pretty basic, but what they're doing in the Management and Mobility Office with PSRC is looking at off-model or post-processing the four-step modeling process to include 5 Ds of built environment, development density, what is really happening in development, land use diversity, street network design, destination accessibility, and distance to transit, none of which typically are in four-step models. Next slide. In the south central region of the state, south of Yakima, the West Powerhouse Road Vicinity Corridor Study, which is a process that the South Central region is commenting on SEEP applications and collaborating with partners on planning studies to set the stage for multimodal solutions. The Yakima Council of Governments is partnering with the City of Yakima, Yakima County, and WSDOT on a study to study traffic issues in the West Powerhouse Road vicinity. The area is confined by, if you've ever been there, it's kind of an interesting geography, very steep cliffs, the Cowiche River and Natchez River valleys. It's mostly mapped floodplain. So a lot of constraints. The land uses are right now are major commercial shopping, medical, office developments, remnant orchards, and that are zoned multifamily residential. So a lot of transition occurring. And the regional gateway trail, which passes through the study area, as well as the existing Cowiche Creek Canyon Trail and planned William Douglas trails are also present, but missing connections. Next slide. Moving over to Lori's region in Kelso, there's in the Kelso couplet, there's a proposed road diet with bike lanes and pedestrian enhancements, kind of like a real street here. Collaboration with partners is leading to active transportation solutions and funding, which is really exciting. The outcome of this work is successful collaboration with the Kalispell Council of Governments, Kelso, Longview, and Cowlitz County, and have been awarded a PED bike grant to actually implement. Next slide, please. Back in the eastern region, another conundrum, difficult situation. This is the West Plains Transportation Management Area, Phase 1. Multi-agency collaboration leads to practical solutions. US 2, as you can see in the graphic, is a long linear east-west road that has been identified in a 2013 joint study with WSDOT, Spokane Transportation Council, and the University of Washington as one of the fastest growing places in the state of Washington. This rapid land use development along the US 2 has occurred without concurrent supporting multimodal transportation networks. So kind of the big, what's that, a STROD? Yeah, big STROD, new language, got to get. US 2 corridor is not able to accommodate these trips that are going to be generated from all the land use in the 2040 land use development plan. So Spokane Regional Transportation Council, in partnership with WSDOT, City of Airway Heights, this is a long list, Fairchild Air Force Base, City of Spokane, Spokane Transit, Spokane County, Spokane International Airport, the Kalispell Tribe, Spokane Tribe, and others. So a lot of partners involved. And others were identified a range of practical solutions, including 2 local networks. So local network streets to provide alternative routes to increase mobility in and around SR2. Next slide. And it's happening up in the north central region as well on US2, the Upper Valley Transportation Study and Active Transportation Solutions to address growth in mobility demand is occurring. WSDOT's worked with local agencies from Coles Corner to Kashmir on a planning study to identify vehicular, transit, and active transportation solutions to congestion problems without the need for costly, infeasible lane expansions. The resulting document provides a roadmap for addressing both present and future transportation challenges arising from growth in the region. Next slide, please. Back in the south central region to the south, if you can look at the 2 graphics, you can get a little sense of what's going on since 1996, which doesn't seem that long ago, but that was all ag land. And now look at it. So there's an ongoing coordination with the city of Pasco on several tasks. Collaborating with their partners will lead to transportation solutions meeting state and local needs. So the South Central region is working with Pasco in support of the city's connected streets policy. A lot of city growth, as well as population projections, current congestion, and increasing development is focused, as you can see, on the north side of 182 and west of the Tri-Cities Airport. And recently, Amazon proposed building a new fulfillment center in the industrial area in the southeast part of the city. The region plans to start a US 12 planning study soon. Big challenges there. And then next slide, back to Eastern region. My final slide here is an interesting conundrum. Heard a lot about this one at the roundtable, at Secretary Millar's roundtable. It's a classic situation where you've got US 95 and I-90 coming together and growth occurring to the south. So what the study is doing here is it's improving and building looking to build and improve and build local alternative routes to accommodate trip growth from land use development. So this rapid land use development along 195 corridor has occurred without a concurrent supporting multimodal transportation network. Another theme here, everything's relying on the state highway. So US 195 intersections and the I-90 US 195 merge will not be able to accommodate the trips projected from all this land use into the 2040 timeframe. So this partnership with Spokane Regional Transportation Council, WSDOT City of Spokane, City of Spokane Transit, Spokane County, and others identified a range of practical solutions, including local network development and alternative routes into the downtown core. And you can kind of see that with all the little dots of improvements and new road connections. So now I'm going to leave this to Lori to take over from here.
Okay, thank you, Todd. So we're going to start in Southwest region. This project is SR 142 ADA improvements. It's a plan for multimodal improvements in the community of Klickitat near Lisle. Bike and ped, safe crossings emphasized, connecting to the trail. Next slide, please. Next one is urban. I have on my slide, I have Northwest region.
Is the graphic the same?
Let me see. I've got it kind of behind the screen. Yes. Okay. This different heading. Sorry about that. So, thank you, Terry. So this is City of Arlington. WSDOT worked with the City of Arlington on a planned action EIS. It's a good example of collaboration to streamline land use processes and funding multimodal improvements. Next slide, please. This is the City of Edmonds, State Route 99 sub-area plan. Again, it's a good example of collaborative effort between City of Edmonds and WSDOT on the SR 99 plan to address multimodal improvements in a timely manner. Next slide, please. This is, we're going to South Central region. This was work between WSDOT, the City of Richland, and the Benton Franklin Council of Governments to identify multimodal improvements to SR 240. Next slide, please. We're now going to Northwest Region, the Mount Baker area. This is State Route 525 in Clinton, an unincorporated Island County community. Basically, it's to develop a safe and easy way for people to walk, bike, or take transit to the ferry instead of driving. Next slide, please. Also, Northwest Region, Mount Baker area again. This is SR 20. It's the spur, and it's a effort with the city of Anacortes and WSDOT working together on a complete streets plan for downtown Main Street. That's also a state route issue that we all encounter frequently at WSDOT with historic main streets, and happen to also be state routes. Next slide, please. Going to Olympic Region. This is an example of low-cost practical solutions for traffic calming in downtown Hoodsport. Next slide, please. Another example from Olympic Region. This is a practical solutions approach where signage was provided to divert cyclists to the Olympic Trail, which is adjacent to US 101. Next slide, please. We are ending it in Southwest Region. This is the City of Ridgefield. Several years ago, City of Ridgefield worked on an interagency agreement governing the future look and feel of SR 501 from Interstate 5 to downtown Ridgefield. As parcels developed, this agreement governs the improvements that the cities will ask for from the developers, so they have that certainty. And that concludes my part of the presentation, and thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Todd and Lori.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a great whirlwind trip around the state. And now I'm going to pass it to John Donahue. John is an assistant state design engineer in the WSDOT Headquarters Design Office and is responsible for overseeing highway design policy and standards development for the agency. Over to you, John.
Thank you. And I had a different background that too, but I guess it didn't work. Okay, so yeah, so I work in the design office here at WSDOT, and part of my responsibility is the development and maintenance of highway design policy. So as part of that, we have done a lot of changes, I'd say, in the past 5 or 6 years having to do with documenting design decisions. And part of that has been including context. Next slide. So our context process has evolved a little bit, and we're now in alignment with NCHRP Report 855, which was conceived, you see the title there, as an expansion of the functional classification, which we had previously depended on for identifying context. Next slide. We're not the only ones. The Green Book, you've probably heard of that, AASHTO Green Book was updated a couple of years ago. It's in the process now of kind of taking in more of the content from 855. I circled that passage there. That's volume 7, or the 7th edition. The 8th edition coming up will do a much more comprehensive look at context and be more in alignment with the things you'll recognize here at WSDOT. Next slide. So starting in 2015 with an update in 2017 looking at 855 and documented a process in chapter 1102 and actually 1103 and developed a template for that documentation, which is known by its, you see that in the lower right, it's known by its acronym CMAR, Context and Modal Accommodation Report. You might hear that phrase around. So that's meant to be used as a place to kind of capture the information about context and is attached to another more central documentation product we use called Basis of Design. Go ahead, next slide. So coming out of 855, you'll see I keep referring back to that and captured in chapter 1102 of the 4 context classifications. And So what we've introduced, and I'll cover in the next couple of slides, is the more or less quantitative process for identifying which context you're in, and then what to do with that. So you see the 4 there. Hopefully recognize those from the pictures. Go ahead, next slide. So the way we use it is, so where we do depart a little bit from 855 is we use context a little specifically here at WSDOT, and it's to try and figure out what to do with design control. That's our language on the design side. We call modal priority. What we do is we utilize something 855 does, which is establish a modal accommodation level. So you kind of see our flow chart there. So on the left is the context work. I'll be talking about that. And then we get into some information about modes, et cetera. This output, though, is called modal accommodation, which gets you over to the design side and basis of design there in the red box. Next slide. So here are the, we'll call them context indicators. These come out of NCHRP 855, and they refer to 3 different factors as they're described in the report: land use, several that have to do with density, 2 that have to do with the setback, that means setback of buildings, and then there are others that you can develop yourself that are project specific. I always like to remind people this is a flexible process. Next slide. So this is out of CMAR. We have a worksheet. This has to do with those elements you see. So we developed this worksheet. If you dive into any of these cells here, you will notice a couple of distinctions. One of them is we always look at current and future since we are building for the future. If you look to the far right, I have circled what the source material is. This is pretty important if you're doing the actual work. We refer to EPA Smart Location Database, which is available online, and I notice planning offices seem to be aware of that. And then aerial photos, so there's some judgment involved in some of this. And then if you look at the far right in the future, this is basically take a look at the comprehensive plan and do some, or I guess in a couple of places we say the zoning code. In any event, you have to kind of refer to and be aware of and familiar with what some of the tools are that local jurisdictions use for planning. Next slide. So this is a little more graphical. Here are the factors that I mentioned on the previous slide. You see you can get this cool mapping from, these are just clips I took from EPA Smart Database using a regular web browser. Those who are familiar with it can probably be a little more fancy than me. And then photo evidence. So we're using some judgment here. We're asking people, and we do some descriptions. There's a little bit of quantitative evidence that we do inject into the process, but don't have time to get into that right now. So anyway, just a couple of ways that we get into these context indicators. Next slide. So what we do is, you notice along the top, we end up with what that designation is after we've looked at the indicators and we develop evidence using that worksheet I flashed in front of you there a couple of slides ago. And you come up with one of the 4, and then you move into this, this cool little easy to use chart, and you come out with what 855 calls the modal accommodation level. And that has to do with 3 different modes. We're focusing on 3 primary modes. That's one of the limitations, I suppose you could say, having to do with our CMAR process at the moment, which is motor vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians. So this is where we depart from 855 a little bit. We call this our initial modal accommodation level. We consider this kind of a coarse tool, especially since there's, as I have said, there's some judgment involved in some of the assessment of those indicators. We want to be sure that design teams have an opportunity to make some adjustments to this. So we move from this easy kind of lookup table, and this table is actually published in the design manual, to a process to get to a final. So go to the next slide, if you would. Somebody like Gary. So this is a worksheet in CMAR, and this is actually most of what CMAR is, which is assemble some evidence that's outside of those indicators that might urge you or create some justification, I guess is a better way to put it, to move from what you saw on the table to maybe a higher or a lower level to accommodate or need to accommodate one of your modes. So so this isn't just an example. I took a clip. Maybe you gather some evidence on the left there that said there's conditions that tend to decrease the need to accommodate bicycles, or there's conditions that tend to increase. So this becomes a worksheet that you can use. We've made some suggestions about what some of these factors are. What you don't see in the clip at the bottom is there's blank spaces there. You can add your own. Next slide. Here's where the payoff is. Once you get to modal accommodation, you made some decisions. Boy, you know, bicycles, there's a high need to accommodate bicycles. There's a high need to accommodate pedestrians. That's documented now in the CMAR. You'd move that information over to basis of design. We turn that into priority language, which is kind of legacy from our process in 2015. In any event, now you move into designing. And so we have a number of these cross sections that are published in chapter 1231. That's our cross section chapter for regular highways, not freeways. And there's a whole bunch of these. I don't remember how many, 6 or 8 of them. And so you can start to plug into, and you actually get into, here's the features I'm going to include in my highway design. And actually here's some dimensions that I'll start applying to it. And now I have the justification, and I've documented on CMAR why, and particularly why I'll be spending perhaps more money, or reallocating money, and reallocating cross-section to other modes. Next slide. And so anyway, we do a class about CMAR and how to fill it out. Basically it's on as needed or by demand. And if you go to our main website there, it's the second from the bottom. That's our design support website. A bunch of these templates are published there. We have a learner's guide too that we use in the training, so that might be handy. And just go to the last slide here. And that's my name. So contact me if you're interested more about how we use context in the design process. How to do.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John.
Sure.
That was awesome. Why don't we take a quick 1 minute, stay at your desk, stretch break. And we were going to have breakout groups in a Mentimeter, but in the interest of time, yes, clapping, good job. We're going to skip this, but if you wouldn't mind, while you're stretching or when you come back, take a couple of minutes to think about what are the opportunities to apply what we've discussed today in your work, and then what might be some challenges to applying this to your work. And we are going to advance to our next segment instead. The economics of transportation and land use.
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you. It is now time to welcome our final guest coming down the home stretch in today's journey. Round out the program, I'd like to welcome Mark Hollenbeck, Director of the Washington State Transportation Center at the University of Washington, to enlighten us about some of the economic aspects of the relationship between transportation and land use. Over to you, Mark.
Enlighten. I hope that works. One, thank you. I have enjoyed listening as best I can while multitasking badly. So that's a true planning job, right? Multitasking as fast as you can, as many things to go on. So Anat asked me to talk about economics of transportation and land use, and it's too good an opportunity to talk about. And so let's just go leap right into this. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to take you back. I mean, I'm teaching the urban transportation planning class right now. As a matter of fact, I have to give an exam this evening. This is like one of the key points in the class. And I'm just going to start with it, even though you should all know it. And that is that transportation itself is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And it takes place so that people can go from one activity to another, or freight that has to move from one location to another location. So the key to everything is activity. Where is it taking place? What does it look like? And what are the attributes associated with it? So land drives travel and the need to travel. Next slide. So the interesting thing about transportation in its first effect with land use is activities only take place if you can actually get to them. Sometimes we like to have inconvenient activities. And one of the reasons we love wilderness areas is there's nobody there. They're wilderness. And so that lack of transportation is actually really good for that kind of activity. On the other hand, if you're a sports stadium, if you can't get people there, no one comes to your team. You don't make any money, and your team goes bankrupt and moves to Los Angeles or Las Vegas or wherever it wants to go. So access almost always has a big impact on the value of the land and the activities that can take place there. Next slide. By the way, people understand that. So the transportation access is huge on the economics of the land, but travel itself is an economic good. The cheaper travel is, the more people travel, the more expensive travel is, the less they travel, and the economics of cost of travel are much more than just money, although money is a big part of it. And I've always loved to ask my students, how many of you are going to go to Mexico on spring break? And, in a class of 40, I might get one or two. And I say, well, what if I could get you round trip airfare to Mexico for $10? How many of you would go? And all the hands go up, or almost all of the hands. And then you think, well, why did you two not show up? Well, I've got kids at home, they're not out of school. So those other costs are the kids at home or other activities that they're responsible for, or right now it would be COVID. So those costs that occur to you change whether in fact you choose to go from the activity you're doing now to another activity. If costs are too high, you don't do that activity. You either stay home and don't do an activity at all, or a different activity, or you choose to do something else. So next slide, if you would. So this, hey, I would really like to go do this, but the costs are too high. That generates the concept of latent demand. When things are congested enough, people don't do activities they really kind of like to do. You can even see this in shifts in travel by time of day. When I head down to Olympia back in the days when we used to come down to Olympia to have meetings like this, as I drive south at 6:30 in the morning on I-5 and you see, or 5:30 in the morning on I-5, you see I-5 is already congested going northbound into the city. And the only reason they're out there at 5:30 in the morning is because they're trying to avoid the worst of the traffic that's going to happen at 7, right? So they are changing their travel demand in relation to the costs that they are experiencing. When you, as planners and engineers, come and deliver new services, often in roads, people take advantage of them. And they take advantage of them both because they're now making trips they wouldn't have otherwise made, but they also take advantage of them by building new activities on land that is suddenly now more accessible as a result of the facilities you're providing. These are all huge economic decisions. Next slide. I didn't time myself. I'm going to pause for just a second and start my timer so I'm not too late because I always talk too long. So in Seattle right now, the transportation and land use, the availability of transportation is really driving development. Now, part of that is this economic impact of providing new accessibility. Part of it, however, is the land use side of the fact that we are encouraging and allowing development to take place. So in the greater Seattle metropolitan area, we are now building out Link, and every time we put a new station, if the city is willing, as much development as the city allows to occurs around those stations, because access to Link gives the people who live there or who are trying to attract employers there greater access to a large number of other activity centers, residential, shopping, commercial, whatever. What it has done is it raises the attractiveness of land relative to other land that might take that growth. Now, this relationship between transportation and land use is not purely universal. I can take a place, that is, there has to be a demand for growth in order for growth to occur as a result of transportation. So if I go out to South Dakota and I build I-92 parallel to I-90, no new development is really going to happen in South Dakota. Maybe a new gas station or two at whatever ramps they put in, interchanges they put in South Dakota, because congestion is not holding back development in South Dakota. Other issues are holding back development in South Dakota. In a place, however, where there's demand for growth, when you provide access and land use permission to allow those to happen, you have raised the attractiveness of specific pieces of land. So when you take transportation and supply it, that is a likely way to encourage growth to occur, and how you supply transportation and how you deal with the land use issues can shape how that growth occurs. Next slide. This is my absolute favorite teaching slide, and you already saw it once. I actually have a PowerPoint slide that's called the famous green slide, and the only thing in the entire PowerPoint presentation is this slide, and I can talk about it for about 45 minutes. The top half of the slide and the bottom half of the slide, separated by the arterial down the middle, are roughly the same amount of development. Roughly the same number of single-family houses, the little boxes, multifamily houses, the big purple boxes. They each have a mall, the blue one, and they each have a school, the red one. The travel behavior, so this is not about density. This is all about land form. Travel behavior in the upper half of the famous green slide is almost entirely automobile driven. The distances are far, the connectivity is bad. So you'll see in this, I wish I had a way I could point out things, but you will see there's a little yellow line that goes between a single family house and a multifamily apartment building in the top half, and the same line in the bottom half. And they are airline distances apart that are equal. So if Sally, who's 8, is trying to go visit her friend Joe's house, who's also 8, how does Sally get to Joe's house? In the upper side half of the green slide, Sally's mother or father drives them there, because there are fences. You can't just walk through the blocked off areas, and the distances are too far. In addition, you probably don't want Sally on what's likely a state route or a major strode on the bottom that is that arterial down the middle, because it's not a pleasant place for an 8-year-old to go. So you're driving the people in the upper half of the famous green slide to drive, because the alternatives don't work. Transit to serve this area can only stay on the major road. If you drive up into those neighborhoods, it takes so long for a bus to go anywhere to anywhere. It becomes uncompetitive to anyone who happens to have an automobile, so they drive. In the bottom half, you can drive from, or you can put a bus on any one of those horizontal streets. Nobody has to walk more than 3 blocks to get to a bus stop. The bus goes directly from area to area. If you are Sally and you're going to Joe's house, you can walk because it's 2 blocks. And if you don't like the one route, you go the other way. And you can ride your bike. You can take your scooter. There are all kinds of other options that make perfectly good sense. So these landforms encourage or discourage particular kinds of travel. And you can look at this from the economic perspective of, in the upper half of the famous green slide, all of our economic signals and time and cost say drive. In the bottom half, all of the economic signals you get are you can do anything you want. Matter of fact, the major problem in the bottom half of the famous green slide is cut through traffic. Next slide. I love to talk about this, but I won't. When you take the famous green slide, it's not about density. When you add density on top of it, you change more of the underlying economic behavior. One of the things that happens in dense land use is land becomes more valuable because you can get a lot more money by building stuff on top of it. And so there is no vacant land. You can't say, oh, we're just not using it, we'll park on top of it. Now you suddenly have to build parking. In the Seattle metropolitan area, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000 a stall. And people are happy to not do that. So density can also impact our willingness to give up road space. Matter of fact, this is why we're having this conversation. It's too hard in too much of the state to provide roads, to widen them. Of course, there are major portions of the state where that's still okay. Next slide, please. So, but density by itself does not say, hey, other modes work. You can build density, like this particular slide, where you are still forced to drive. Imagine walking from a bus, taking a bus to this particular office building. There's lots of activity there. There's plenty of people. It's not a matter of could there be transit trips, but somewhere in this process, you would put a bus stop on either side of one of these major stroads, which means either coming to work or going home from work, you have to cross that road. You have to walk across this major parking lot. It's an incredibly unpleasant environment, pedestrian hostile. And as a transit person, you're going to be a pedestrian at some point. So our land forces you to drive, right? And that forces the owners of this particular facility to supply a lot of money into the parking space, which they could sell that space and build other buildings on top of. Next slide, please. So matching the transportation system, going into that old slide and saying, hey, we're going to make this work for transit. Oh boy, that's a tough planning operation, and it's a tough engineering operation. Matching what kind of transportation system you want to the land uses that are there, or making sure you can adjust the land uses and the networks that are there to fit the kinds of transportation you need is really important. Somebody earlier mentioned some really good work in the state of Florida. They also, like us, have a concurrency regulation. They've been working on multimodal districts. There's some really good work done by Ruth Steiner at the University of Florida, the Multimodal Transportation Districts and Level of Service Handbook. You can download that off the internet. And they talk about where these things work, all right? So there are a variety of urban centers where transportation activity can be multimodal, where walking works, where biking works, if you provide the right kinds of infrastructure to make it possible. Next slide. There are other land uses where those opportunities are not nearly as effective. And if you go out and say, well, everyone is going to bike here because we're going to build this infrastructure, well, they might not use it very much because the opportunity to go anywhere, the distances are too far. It doesn't feel safe. I love that Strode's video, by the way. So you have to, as you look to plan and look to choose the places you are going to spend your money on multimodal transportation, and as you look to discourage single occupancy driving to avoid having to widen roads that are too expensive and too difficult to widen, look to where you can make those improvements where the land uses can be compatible with your transportation options, because not everywhere works. Next slide, please. And a lot of that is driven because everybody is making economic decisions. A key aspect of those economic decisions, however, is they're not true economics, they're perceived economics. My favorite example on that is, do you actually think of what it costs you to drive your car to the grocery store? And the answer is, I guarantee you no, unless you're out of gas. If you're out of gas and you're thinking, do I really need to make this? It's going to be 40 bucks to fill up this gas tank. Yeah, let me think about it. I don't need milk today. It's okay, I'll have water, right? On the other hand, the real cost is somewhere on the order of 55 cents a mile driving, but you don't think, as you're going to choose to go to the store or not go to the store, you don't think, well, it's going to be 4 miles. That's going to cost me about $2.10, right? No, that's not how you think. So if we're looking, because we've hidden those costs, and so you are acting quite rationally, but only from a perceptual level. So one of the ways we are interested in changing people's behavior is to surface the real costs of their driving. The downside of surfacing the real costs of driving, making sure people are aware and paying for their services, is if we've built all of our environment in the upper half of the famous green slide, going in and saying, I'm going to charge you every time you drive, all you're going to do is get whoever is allowing that to happen unelected. Because if there's no valid alternative to driving, because you've segregated the land uses, you don't have enough infrastructure, if there's no good alternative, all you do is piss people off and raise the cost of doing the activities they want to do. Next slide, please. So we like to surface actual dollar values. Anybody who's done travel demand management knows the best way to shift mode split to a place of business is to raise the cost of parking. Now, my 2 slides here are the University of Washington. We are the poster child of this. The slide on the left is the main student lot And this was taken by Scott Rutherford in about I'd say late 80s, early 90s. This lot filled up every day by 8:30 in the morning. It was, 50 cents at the time, something like that, 50 cents a day parking. There was a lot to the left of the, or excuse me, to the right of the picture you see on the right. The picture on the right is taken on a daylight shot in a current condition. To the right of the stadiums that you can see there was the overflow lot. It would fill up by noon. To the right of that was another overflow lot, which would sometimes fill up and sometimes not. When the university put in significant parking charges with our UPass program over time, the Montlake lot itself is not full. Matter of fact, if you look at the top half of the picture on the right side, all of those cars there actually belong to Children's Hospital employees. The university is renting that space to Children's Hospital, and they bus their employees from the UW parking lot over to Children's. This is how much parking at the university has declined as a result of parking charges, but also increasing the services to get here. So the university takes parking, it pays the money from parking, it pays for bus service, bike racks, walking improvements, other ways to also make the network opportunities work. So in travel demand management, raising parking prices is great, but you have to have alternatives. Next slide, please. I'm almost out of it. A real question then becomes is, can you actually charge for parking, particularly when you get away from dense urban areas which are already charging for parking? Businesses resist constantly the issue of charging for parking on street near their businesses. They fear that those costs will make them less attractive to their competitors. And that's a real economic fear. They get this connection between land use and transportation. An interesting aspect of it that came from Shoup's There Is No Free Parking books are if you give businesses the opportunity to spend the money that that's actually being collected by the city for that parking. And suddenly you will find a significant change in the percentage of people who are against parking. If the businesses get to choose, hey, we're going to take this money and we're going to spend it on improving the street attractiveness and cleaning the streets and providing security, whatever they think is important to raise the attractiveness of their businesses, suddenly, hey, this parking price thing isn't a bad thing. On the other hand, if the money goes to the city and they don't see those kinds of improvements, it's only negative. So this economics, trust me, they understand economics and they understand the economics of this combination. And the question is, how do you use your understanding and their understanding in order to get the outcomes you want? Next slide, please. So you've seen other ways of bringing pricing into it. On the left is the London Cordon Ring. On the right is what happened on 520 when we started charging for that as a result of the new pricing. In both cases, there were places to go, pretty good transit options. In both cases, you saw very significant changes in the number of people driving on these facilities. Next slide, please. But again, you have quality alternatives. So what happens if you're not in Seattle or London or another really big place? Well, there are effective ways to build these connected, multiple land use, walkable, transit-oriented areas. Now, transit or not, again, if you're in a really rural area, transit's not going to be your solution, but biking and walking can be. And there are ways you can take advantage of these economic incentives. Next slide, please. We'll step through these really quickly. You can look at things like shared use parking. This is my favorite parking garage in the entire state. This is the Kirkland Library. It is underneath the library. It's open for the library. It also serves, you can see the baseball diamond lights in the back. There's a theater. There's a community pool just to the right. And to the left of this is the downtown Kirkland restaurant district. And this parking facility is used 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. What a great facility. And yet it serves this mixed use opportunity and cuts down the need for parking elsewhere, which livens up the area. Keep going. Next slide. This is another great opportunity, and you can take this to the rural areas. Build cool destinations on your bike trails. So this actually is one of 2 breweries on the Burke-Gilman in Kenmore. By the way, Bothell ought to have some of these as well. And you follow these trails. There are all kinds of businesses now oriented on the bike trail. Next slide. Next slide. So here's the 2 gardens, and this is a destination area that's got a state highway next to it, but it is a great example of what you saw in the Netherlands. It's a separated trail. It's a really great place to ride, and you can ride there, stop, have a beer, you can have lunch, you can have dinner. You can then use that as a core location in a rural area on one of these cool trails that we're building to drive people to here. You can put a little parking lot on the other side and people can drive to it as well, and then build around it. You can take advantage of these transportation facilities to improve economic activity and sell them locally. This is why you want to do it. Next slide, please. So when done correctly, everyone wins. In Portland, where there's a huge emphasis on bike travel, there's been good studies by Portland State showing that doing bike lanes actually improves the business improves the economic activity to businesses along those bike trails. But this is Portland. It's a local area where this really makes sense. If you do this in a small city in the rural Washington, you're not going to get the same results. Although those opportunities do exist to do cool things along those bike trails. Next slide. Almost done here. Trying quickly to be done. Next slide. So a real question becomes, how do you convince people to do this? So this is the Tukwila Sounder Station. We were in Tukwila talking to them about the GTEC program, so Growth and Transportation Efficiency Centers. Tukwila was trying desperately to take advantage of the Tukwila Sounder, and you can see from my annotations, there's almost no housing around it. They had Tukwila actually changed land use designations here to encourage housing, and they couldn't get the developers to actually build it. The question then becomes, how do you convince builders that this is an economically good thing to do? In the core areas of Seattle, it makes perfectly good sense. Nobody comments on it. Next slide, please. In other parts of the state, you have a much more difficult time. Here's the Sumner train station, another opportunity to do something. And if you look, it's industrial, it's single-family housing. Is Sumner interested in building mixed-use, higher-density activity here? Or are you going to take away activity from another part of Sumner that is businesses thinking, wait a minute, don't put in competing economic activity to me? So those are tough planning questions that you have to be aware of that are both driven by existing businesses. I have a son who lives in Mill Creek, and I think, oh, please don't just build housing up here. Put some shopping, put some retail up here. But the core businesses in Mill Creek fight that desperately. So be aware that there are all of these economic activities, and they are very aware of what transportation means for that. Next question. Or next slide, excuse me. So making progress. I love the location eats designed for breakfast. Everything in this environment is local. So when you're trying to make these improvements, be creative, understand the local conditions, look for local economic incentives that make sense to the people who are there. Where necessary, take those people out to go visit other areas. I was out talking to Kenmore 15 years ago and was talking about, hey, you could put housing over top of your Safeway here. There would be a lot more people who would be walking around taking advantage of the trail. Trust me, they would buy it. And the Safeway developing guy said, no, we would never do that. Safeway would never let that happen. And my thought was, have you been in Seattle? It's like your highest grossing Safeways have things built on them. So being able to take people and have those conversations, whether the political decision makers or whether the development community, understanding what these opportunities are and how they can make money, how they can improve their community is a huge part of your planning activity. Okay, and I think that's it. You can go one more slide, but I think I'm done. And oh yeah, the ending slide. If you go back 20 years ago, Seattle didn't do recycling, and now recycling is in our DNA. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes slow change, but pretty soon you look back on it and go, of course we did that. Why wouldn't we have done that? Because it requires that thought, and so that's how we have to get this planning activity out there. there's a lot of economic incentive. Now, I saw at least one hand go up. Celeste, I talked too long. Sorry about that. Back to you.
Thanks so much. We've had a lot we've packed into this time, and that was fantastic, Mark. See, we probably could have spent a whole morning on all of our presenters, but really appreciate them packing it in so that we could share their words of wisdom with all of you. So we've got a last question, and would be great for you to reflect on what's one thing you can do to apply what we discussed today and put that in the Menti. Given time, we're just gonna go forward and wrap up here. So this was sort of a sharing of what we've got, summarizing the transportation land use integration work. There's a lot of other work underway, finalizing the guiding principles. We're working on capability maturity framework to do around the agency, getting ready for supporting the comp plan update cycle, and much more. So if you're interested in being engaged, connect with Terry or me. Thanks. And next slide. Just a few final sources of inspiration wanted to share with you. And I think that the last here, back to Ryan to let you know what's coming next in the series. Thanks so much for spending the morning with us.
All right, thank you very much. We are a little over time, so I just wanted to show you a slide here of our upcoming trainings. The next one will be on travel data collection, and throughout the fall and winter here, we'll have a series of data trainings. So be looking for those. They're always the fourth Thursday of each month, except for November and December. So contact me if you have any more questions about those. Thanks very much, everyone, for attending, and we will see you next month.